Senator John Kennedy has built a reputation not through fiery outbursts or grandstanding, but through a kind of rhetorical sharpness that catches his opponents off guard. In this exchange with Representative Adam Schiff, Kennedy employed that precision like a scalpel. His approach wasn't to shout Schiff down or dominate the conversation with bombastic language. Instead, he posed one calm, deliberate question, focused, pointed, and difficult to sidestep. Do you believe any of the lies told about Trump in the Steele dossier should disqualify you from commenting on election disinformation? That single question reshaped the entire tone of the hearing. It wasn't just about the Steele dossier. It was about trust, consistency, and credibility. Kennedy knew that bringing up the dossier wouldn't just trigger a discussion about its contents, but about Schiff's past advocacy of it. By invoking the Steele dossier, Kennedy wasn't dredging up old talking points for the sake of nostalgia. He was asking whether someone who had stood by such a controversial and later discredited document should still serve as an authoritative voice on disinformation. The brilliance of Kennedy's strategy lay in the fact that he didn't accuse Schiff of lying, nor did he demand a retraction or apology. He simply asked whether Schiff saw a contradiction between his prior role in promoting elements of the Steele dossier and his current criticism of political misinformation. In doing so, Kennedy placed the burden of reflection on Schiff, making it his responsibility to explain or defend his position in light of past actions. It wasn't just a challenge. It was an invitation to accountability. The tone of the question also mattered. Kennedy didn't ask it with anger or sarcasm. He didn't adopt a combative posture. Instead, he delivered it in the same tone someone might use when asking a witness to clarify a timeline or a financial figure. That kind of tone doesn't give the other person room to turn the moment into a performance. Schiff couldn't accuse Kennedy of attacking him or of being partisan. There was no dramatic delivery to object to, only the quiet weight of the question itself. And that's why the question had such impact. It was not loud, but it was loaded. It forced a choice. Either Schiff had to admit a past error or double down on a position that many now regard as deeply flawed. The question drew a straight line between past and present, making it difficult to isolate his current commentary on election integrity from the controversy surrounding his prior rhetoric. What made it even more effective was the timing. Kennedy waited. He didn't interrupt. He let Schiff speak first, let him build his argument, and then, with surgical precision, cut to the heart of the issue. There was no need to digress into unrelated topics or to frame the question as an ideological attack. Kennedy simply asked if a person who had been part of spreading unproven allegations should be the one to lecture others on political truth. In a political climate where grandstanding and sound bites often take center stage, Kennedy's restraint gave his question even more weight. It wasn't shouted across the room. It was placed, like a quiet but unavoidable obstacle in front of Schiff. The calmness amplified the tension. It gave the moment a sense of gravity, not theater. The simplicity of the question, paired with the complexity of what it implied, was what made it so effective. In that instant, Kennedy didn't just challenge Schiff's statement. He challenged the foundation upon which Schiff stood as an authority on disinformation. He didn't bring evidence, charts, or dramatic accusations. He brought one line of inquiry, rooted in Schiff's own history, and let it hang in the air. The audience didn't need follow-up commentary to understand its significance. The silence that followed spoke volumes, and Schiff's visible discomfort only confirmed that this wasn't just an ordinary exchange. It was a carefully calibrated strike. Adam Schiff is no stranger to high-pressure political environments. Over the years, he has become one of the most recognizable figures in congressional hearings and media commentary, particularly around topics involving former President Donald Trump. Schiff has built much of his public reputation on his work during the Trump-Russia investigations, where he prominently cited the Steele dossier as part of his broader narrative about foreign interference and presidential misconduct. For a time, that position earned him praise from segments of the media and his political base. But the dossier's credibility has since unraveled, with key elements discredited and sources questioned, turning what was once a political weapon into a lingering liability. That shift in public understanding created a vulnerability, one that Senator John Kennedy tapped into with precision. When Kennedy asked whether Schiff's previous promotion of the Steele dossier undermines his authority to speak on the dangers of political disinformation, the question struck directly at that vulnerability. It wasn't a random swipe. It was a calculated move based on well-documented history, and Schiff wasn't ready for it. The unpreparedness was immediately visible. As soon as Kennedy posed the question, Schiff's usual confident posture gave way to hesitation. He began to respond, but his answer lacked the forcefulness that typically characterizes his public statements. Instead of addressing the core of the question, whether his past defense of now discredited claims made him less credible, Schiff tried to pivot, referring to broader concerns about foreign interference and the context in which the Steele dossier was originally cited. But the attempt to shift the narrative didn't land effectively. Kennedy wasn't pushing a broad conspiracy or making an emotionally charged accusation. He was simply asking a question about accountability. Schiff's discomfort stemmed from the fact that the question didn't allow for the kind of sweeping rhetorical defense he often uses. It demanded specificity, something difficult to produce without acknowledging either an error in judgment or a continued defense of something widely seen as flawed. This put Schiff in a dilemma. To answer directly and acknowledge that the Steele dossier was flawed would be to admit a lapse in judgment during one of the most high-profile political investigations in recent memory. But to double down and insist that the dossier still had value would be to ignore the findings of multiple investigations and intelligence assessments that have discredited large portions of it. Either path risked political cost, and in that moment, Schiff appeared caught in between. What made this moment more impactful was Schiff's lack of readiness for it. He is typically well prepared for Republican pushback and usually frames such encounters as politically motivated attacks. But Kennedy didn't give him that opportunity. The question was framed with just enough detachment to make it hard for Schiff to dismiss it as partisan noise. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't buried in a list of grievances. It stood alone, simple, and hard to dodge. Had Schiff anticipated this line of questioning, he might have come armed with a strategic response, perhaps acknowledging that the Steele dossier contained flaws, but justifying his past references to it within the broader context of foreign interference. Instead, what the public saw was a rare moment where a polished communicator appeared caught off balance. His attempts to reframe the issue were not only unsuccessful, but also highlighted how unprepared he was to confront the contradiction between his past statements and the current political narrative he's trying to shape. That sense of being unprepared mattered because it disrupted the control Schiff usually exerts in these settings. He often dominates hearings through tight messaging and confident delivery, but in this instance, that control slipped. And once it did, Kennedy didn't need to do much more. The effectiveness of the exchange wasn't in a long back and forth. It was in watching someone so often composed and deliberate, suddenly scrambling to justify a position that had aged poorly. It became a reminder that in politics, past statements don't disappear, they accumulate, and they can reemerge at inopportune times. Schiff's inability to anticipate and effectively respond to such a predictable line of questioning revealed more than a lapse in strategy. It exposed a deeper challenge he faces in reconciling past rhetoric with present responsibility. One of the most striking elements of the exchange between Senator John Kennedy and Representative Adam Schiff was not the content of the question itself, but the manner in which it was delivered. Kennedy didn't raise his voice, interrupt, or grandstand. There were no theatrical gestures or emotionally charged words. Instead, he relied entirely on tone, steady, calm, and matter-of-fact, to underscore the seriousness of his question. In doing so, he took away any opportunity for Schiff to deflect by accusing him of launching a partisan attack or engaging in performative politics. It was the calmness, more than anything, that gave Kennedy the upper hand and left Schiff with no effective rhetorical escape. This is what made the moment so powerful. In a political climate often dominated by emotional outbursts, viral sound bites, and loud confrontations, Kennedy did something relatively rare. He let silence and simplicity do the work. By speaking without raising tension, he forced the question to stand on its own merit. Schiff was confronted not by a storm of accusations, but by a mirror. one that reflected his past statements and forced him to contend with them in the present. The lack of drama made the question feel more like a statement of fact, which is much harder to argue against. When Kennedy asked Schiff whether promoting false elements of the Steele dossier undermines his credibility on election disinformation, the question could have easily turned into a shouting match in a different setting, or with a different tone. But Kennedy avoided that entirely. His demeanor gave the question an added sense of legitimacy. It came across not as a political jab, but as a genuine point of inquiry. The implication was that this was something any reasonable observer might wonder, not just a senator looking for a headline. Adam Schiff, known for his assertive responses in high-stakes situations, found himself in an unfamiliar position. He didn't have an opponent to fight back against, because Kennedy wasn't fighting. He was simply asking. Schiff's typical strategy, which often involves reframing questions into broader narratives or painting criticism as politically motivated, didn't work here. There was no charged language to rebut, no personal attack to call out, no indignation to lean into. Kennedy had left him no room to shift blame or redirect the conversation. This method of questioning can be more effective than any aggressive tactic. It disarms the subject not through confrontation, but through the absence of it. Schiff, who has built a public persona around being composed, methodical, and often morally assertive, was instead forced into a reactive stance. He couldn't accuse Kennedy of being unfair, because the tone and content of the question gave no grounds for such a claim. He couldn't invoke outrage or take the moral high ground, because Kennedy hadn't said anything that would justify that kind of response. The power imbalance that emerged in that moment was subtle but undeniable. Moreover, the calm tone had another effect. It allowed the audience to focus entirely on the substance of the question. There was no distraction, no noise. Viewers and attendees could absorb what was being asked and draw their own conclusions without being swept up in emotion or spectacle. Kennedy's delivery essentially handed the focus over to the question itself, as if to say, "This speaks for itself." And in many ways, it did. By contrast, Schiff's response seemed hurried and defensive. The absence of hostility in Kennedy's tone made Schiff's discomfort all the more noticeable. He appeared flustered not because he was under attack, but because he had been quietly cornered. There's a distinct kind of pressure that comes from being challenged, not with aggression, but with unrelenting calm. It forces clarity. It removes theatrics. And it compels the person being questioned to either answer directly or reveal their avoidance through body language and hesitation. Kennedy's use of tone wasn't just a tactical choice, it was a philosophical one. It conveyed the belief that questions of accountability shouldn't require shouting to be taken seriously, and by holding that line, he created a moment that stood out precisely because it wasn't loud. The restraint in delivery gave the question weight, and the silence that followed only amplified it. In that stillness, Schiff's inability to deliver a strong, composed answer became the loudest part of the exchange. When Adam Schiff stood up and walked out of the hearing room, it wasn't accompanied by slammed papers or raised voices. There was no dramatic declaration or final word. But the simplicity of the moment, its quietness, spoke louder than any verbal sparring might have. Schiff's exit didn't feel like the confident conclusion of a well-fought argument. It felt like the closing of a conversation he no longer wanted to continue, and in a setting as public and politically charged as a Senate hearing, that was more revealing than anything he had said during the exchange itself. The interaction with Senator John Kennedy had begun as a typical round of questioning. But when Kennedy posed a single, focused question about Schiff's past involvement in promoting the Steele dossier and whether that should disqualify him from speaking authoritatively on election disinformation, the atmosphere in the room changed. Kennedy's tone was calm. He wasn't accusing Schiff of lying. He wasn't calling him names. He simply asked a question that linked Schiff's past to his present, requiring a thoughtful, possibly uncomfortable answer. Schiff's response didn't offer that clarity. He pivoted, he generalized, and he attempted to frame the question as irrelevant to the current issue. But the effect was clear. He didn't want to engage with the premise Kennedy had laid out. It was too precise, too directly connected to a topic that had haunted Schiff's credibility over the years. And because the question hadn't been asked with any hostility or visible bias, it became harder for Schiff to brush it off as just another partisan swipe. When Schiff made the choice to leave, it was not interpreted as the conclusion of his testimony. It was interpreted, fairly or not, as a refusal to face a question that had touched a nerve. Political hearings are full of long-winded exchanges, grandstanding, and prepared statements. But rarely does a quiet, orderly exit leave such a clear impression. It was the kind of silence that made people lean in, wondering not just why he walked out, but what he was walking away from. The contrast between Kennedy's approach and Schiff's reaction made the moment even more striking. Kennedy hadn't launched into a tirade. He hadn't tried to overpower Schiff or talk over him. The absence of confrontation on Kennedy's end made Schiff's departure feel less like self-defense and more like avoidance. People watching could draw their own conclusions. Was Schiff unable to answer the question honestly without admitting a past error? Did he feel trapped by the political consequences of either answer? Whatever the reason, his exit left those questions hanging in the air with no resolution. It also shifted the power dynamic in the room. In any hearing, control is an invisible currency. The person who appears composed, confident, and unshaken tends to leave the stronger impression, regardless of party or ideology. Schiff, known for his control and poise in tense political environments, relinquished both when he walked out. Kennedy, by contrast, maintained his composure throughout. He didn't gloat or push the issue further. He didn't follow up with a barrage of comments. He simply let the moment sit, allowing the silence to do the work that words didn't need to. What followed Schiff's exit wasn't uproar or disorder. There was no applause, no condemnation, just a room that had suddenly grown quieter. That kind of silence in a political space is rare, and it's powerful. It signaled that something meaningful had just occurred, even if it hadn't been marked by drama. The moment lingered because it was so different from the noise that typically surrounds partisan confrontation. And Schiff's absence from the rest of the hearing only magnified the impact. Public perception in politics isn't just shaped by what is said. It's shaped by what is left unsaid, by body language, timing, and tone. Schiff's exit, following a question he clearly did not want to answer, created a visual metaphor that stuck. He didn't just decline to answer, he removed himself from the setting where the answer was expected. That visual, leaving the room, rather than confronting a past that continues to shadow his role in current debates, became the most memorable part of the exchange. It turned a calm, focused inquiry into a defining moment without raising a single voice. The exchange between Senator John Kennedy and Representative Adam Schiff will be remembered not for its volume, but for its clarity. In an age when political discourse is often defined by dramatic gestures, talking points, and combative headlines, this moment stood out for being remarkably subdued and yet deeply revealing. Kennedy's question about Schiff's past promotion of the Steele dossier wasn't just an attempt to score political points. It was a test of consistency, accountability, and the weight of public trust. And it was a test that Schiff, whether due to discomfort or calculation, chose not to engage with fully. What made the moment resonate was how little it relied on spectacle. Kennedy's restraint gave his question a kind of quiet gravity. He didn't need to accuse or provoke. He simply connected Schiff's current advocacy against election disinformation with his earlier involvement in a narrative that was later discredited. That linkage, though subtle in delivery, struck at the core of Schiff's public image, an image built around defending truth and exposing falsehoods. When that image was challenged not through attack, but through a calm inquiry, it left little room for deflection. Schiff's decision to leave the hearing without directly addressing the question didn't just end a line of discussion, it created a powerful absence. It raised questions in the minds of viewers and participants alike. Why not answer? Why not clarify? Why not defend the record if it could stand on its own? In politics, silence and retreat often speak louder than rebuttal. Schiff's walkout, though orderly and controlled, carried the weight of unresolved tension. It didn't look like resolution. It looked like escape. This exchange served as a reminder that credibility in public life is cumulative. It's not only about what you say today, but about how that stands against what you've said before. Schiff, who has long been at the center of contentious debates about truth, transparency, and accountability, found himself confronted by his own record and had little interest in defending it under quiet, direct scrutiny. Kennedy didn't need to follow up. He didn't need to press further. The question had done its work, and Schiff's response, or lack of one, left its own kind of lasting impression. In that way, the encounter was less about confrontation and more about contrast, the calm versus the evasive, the steady versus the unsettled. In a political environment saturated with noise, it was the simplicity and silence of this moment that made it stand out. No fireworks, no headlines screamed across microphones. Just a question, an uncomfortable pause, and an early exit that said more than any closing statement could.